She pushed his envelope of money back into the rain that night and told him she had no use for a stranger's cash. What she wanted was the truth about the wound bleeding quietly beneath his coat. Months later, when the whole city had turned its back and branded him a guilty man, that same woman would walk through a courtroom door no one expected her to open, carrying in her hands the one thing that could overturn it all. Some debts can never be paid in money. Some can only be paid in trust, placed in the right hands, in long and silent nights, and in a thin folder kept hidden for years, waiting for the single moment it was meant to be opened. A man whose very name once made an entire city hold its breath. A woman who had never, not even once, been afraid of him. And an old secret buried deeper than either of them ever knew, waiting to be drawn up into the light. If this story moves you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. Chicago rain in November didn't fall. It lashed. It found every opening at the collar, every crack in the concrete behind St. Meridian Hospital. And it asked Delaney Rourke what she was doing out here, at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. One hand holding a bag of medical trash, her eyes fixed on a shadow that shouldn't have been there. The man was sitting against the brick wall beside the back door, where the sickly yellow light reached only half his face. His dark coat hung open, and beneath the white fabric of his shirt, a stain was spreading slowly, steadily, in the way 7 years as a night shift nurse had taught her to recognize at once. It wasn't sweat, it was blood, and it had been flowing for far too long. She set the trash bag down. She didn't scream, didn't run to call security, and didn't step back. She only took 2 steps forward and crouched down level with him, close enough to see that his lips had faded into a pallor no human body ought to have. The man lifted his head. His eyes swept over her once, quick and cold, the gaze of someone used to measuring everyone around him by how much danger they might pose. Then he slipped a hand inside his coat, and what he pulled out wasn't a weapon, but a thick envelope, folded in half, shoved toward her with the gesture of a man accustomed to using money to end every conversation before it had a chance to begin. "You leave here," he said, his voice hoarse but still carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders. "You didn't see anything. You weren't here." Delaney looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the blood stain. Then she pushed the envelope back, gently but firmly, placing it on his thigh as though returning something that didn't belong to her. "I don't need money from a stranger," she said. "What I need is for you to tell me the truth about how deep that wound is, what caused it, and how long you've been losing blood. Because if you answer wrong, I'll save you the wrong way, and then the money in this envelope won't buy anything back for you." For a moment, the man only stared at her. He had built an entire life on making other people afraid, and he knew the scent of fear, the way it made voices tremble, the way it made eyes look away, the way it made hands reach for pockets. The woman in front of him had none of that. She was waiting for his answer the way a craftsman waits for measurements, no more and no less. "A knife," he said at last, as though he himself were surprised he was answering. "Left side, about 40 minutes ago. Didn't hit anything vital, or I wouldn't still be sitting here." Delaney gave one nod and had already begun working before he even finished the sentence. She pulled his coat aside, pressed the heel of her hand over the wound with just enough force to make him draw in a sharp breath. 40 minutes, and you're still conscious like this, so you're luckier than you think," she said. "But luck isn't something that lasts. You're coming inside with me." "No," he answered at once, and this time his voice hardened. "No hospital, no paperwork, no name of mine on any form. So you're planning to bleed to death by this back door just to keep your name clean?" she asked, not mockingly, but simply laying the truth on the table. "That's a strange price to pay for pride." She stood, disappeared behind the door for less than a minute, then came back with an emergency kit she kept in her own locker for nights when official procedure wasn't fast enough to save anyone. She knelt beside him, tore open a sterile packet, and began doing the kind of work that should have required 3 people and an operating room. "What's your name?" she asked, not because she was curious, but because she needed him awake, needed him talking. "James," he answered after a pause too long to be true. "James Cooper." Delaney didn't stop working. She threaded the needle, tied the suture, and kept her voice steady, as though they were talking about the weather. "No," she said softly. "You hesitated before answering, and people only hesitate when they have to make something up. But that's all right. You can be James Cooper tonight if you want. I don't stitch wounds for a name. I stitched them for the person who's bleeding." The man looked down at the crown of her head, at the hands holding his life in place with a steadiness not even the most loyal men in his empire had ever possessed when standing before him. And for the first time in many years, he was silent, not because he was calculating the next move, but because he truly didn't know what to say. The rain kept lashing the tin awning overhead, steady and cold. Delaney tied the last stitch, then lifted her eyes to the pale face of the stranger whom the whole city, if it knew where he was sitting tonight, would surely react to in many different ways. "It's done," she said. "You'll live. But you owe me the truth, not money. And someday I'm going to collect." The man left the hospital's back door before dawn, leaving the envelope on the plastic chair, where Delaney still sat to rest between shifts, and she hadn't touched it. She had pushed it into the lost and found locker as though, if she simply didn't see it, that night had never happened. But some things refused to stay still inside a locker. 3 nights later, when Delaney had just finished her shift and stepped into the employee parking garage in the basement, she realized the lot was emptier than usual, and the light in the far corner had gone out in a way lights didn't go out on their own. 2 men were standing beside her old car, one leaning against the driver's door, the other blocking the way, both wearing dark coats and carrying the calm air of men who knew they didn't need to hurry. "Miss Rourke." The one standing closer said, calling her by the right last name, though she had never given it to any stranger, and that alone was enough to send a chill down her spine. "You work those night shifts hard," the other man went on, his voice light, as though he were truly concerned. "This hospital doesn't pay much for someone trying to survive alone in a city this expensive. We only stopped by to remind you of one small thing. Some nights are best forgotten. Some faces are best never seen at all." Delaney stopped a few steps away from them, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag, and she understood at once who they were talking about. She understood that the man whose wound she had stitched 3 nights earlier wasn't some ordinary hired blade, but someone with enough men under him to send people straight to the place where she worked, someone who knew her name, knew her shift, and even knew the car she drove. "What do you want me to forget?" she asked, and her voice didn't shake, though her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid they could hear it. "I stitch wounds for dozens of people every week. I don't remember anyone's face longer than they stay on the table." The man leaning against her car door smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Then that's good," he said. "Keep your memory that bad. It's better for your health than you think." He reached into his coat pocket, and Delaney knew what was about to appear. She knew it would be another envelope, more money, another way these people believed everything in the world had a price, and every person would bow once that price was high enough. She didn't wait for him to pull it out. "I'll tell you something," she cut in, taking half a step forward instead of stepping back. And that half step alone made both men falter for an instant, because they were used to people retreating. "I'm not staying quiet because I'm afraid of you, and I'm not staying quiet because of your money. I haven't told anyone about that night because that's my job. When someone comes to me in a crisis, I save them, and whatever belongs to that person is that person's business. But if you think you can come to my parking garage and teach me how to remember or forget, then you've got the wrong woman. I have nothing to lose that you haven't already tasted, and a person with nothing left to lose is very hard to threaten." The parking garage went silent for one long beat. The man blocking the way looked toward his companion, and in the look they exchanged, there was something almost like confusion, because the script they had brought here had no place for a slender woman who worked the night shift and dared to step forward instead of back. "You're brave," the man standing closer said at last, and this time his voice no longer carried that false concern. "But bravery doesn't pay rent, Miss Rourke. If you lose this job, you lose everything. We know that very well, and so do you." The sentence struck exactly where it hurt, because it was true, because this job was the only thing standing between her and the edge she had stood beside too many times before, and they knew it, had looked into it before coming here. But Delaney didn't let them see the crack. "Then do what you came here to do," she said softly, her voice so calm it surprised even her. "And I'll keep doing what I do tonight, saving anyone who comes to me, including the people who sent you here. Now move, I need to go home." She stepped forward, squeezing between the 2 men with her head held high. Though she wasn't sure she had any right to hold it that way, she opened the car door, got in, and started the engine. while her hands shook so badly she had to try twice before she could fit the key in. When she drove out of the underground lot, she looked through the rearview mirror and saw the two men still standing there, not following her, only watching, and one of them had taken out his phone and pressed it to his ear, reporting back to someone that the woman at St. Meridian Hospital wasn't afraid, wouldn't take money, and wasn't the kind of person whose silence could be bought with an envelope. The call the two men in the parking garage made that night eventually reached the person who needed to hear it, and that person was Sullivan Marsh, though no one at the Chicago Harbor dared say that name aloud when he was in the room. The next morning, on the top floor of a building overlooking the gray water of Lake Michigan, a port licensing official sat across from Marsh, speaking in the manner of a man trying to keep his voice from betraying him. He had entered the room with a full set of reasons why a certain transport permit could not be renewed. But when Marsh merely rested his hand on the tabletop and looked at him, those reasons automatically grew smaller, softer, until they turned into promises that he would review it, that he would find a way, that he would have an answer before the end of the week. Marsh didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't promise anything at all. He only thanked the man for coming, and the official left the room with the relief of someone who had just escaped a dangerous place, without understanding exactly why it was dangerous. That was how Marsh's power worked, not through displays, but through the reactions of everyone who stepped into his line of sight, the way they lowered their voices, chose their words, and avoided his eyes as though avoiding something they didn't want to admit they feared. When the door closed, the man standing quietly in the corner stepped forward and poured him a glass of water, and that was Abel, the man who had been at Marsh's side longer than anyone else in the organization, an aging, soft-spoken man with the calloused hands of someone who had once done heavy labor before fate drew him into the orbit of the Marsh family. Abel never asked unnecessary questions, never tried to curry favor, and perhaps that was why Marsh trusted him in a way he trusted no one else, a quiet trust built over many years that neither of them had ever named. "There's trouble at Pier 7, Abel said quietly, setting the glass down. "Our people found a shipment that was redirected, and the numbers don't match. Someone has been selling information to the group on the south side." Sitting in the chair across the room, a third man spoke, his voice courteous and warm, the voice of someone who always knew how to place a sentence at exactly the right moment so it would sound most agreeable, and that was Wesley Payne, Marsh's financial advisor, the man who managed the numbers the entire organization revolved around. "I've looked over the books," Payne said, smiling his steady, composed smile. "The man is Halloran in dispatch. The evidence is fairly clear, sir. I think we should handle it quickly before it spreads." Marsh didn't answer right away. He rose, walked to the glass wall, looked down at the cranes slowly unloading containers at the harbor below, and in that moment his face revealed nothing at all. No anger, no hesitation, only the cold calculation of a man who had made this kind of decision so many times that it no longer forced him to think for long. "Halloran has a family," Abel said, and the sentence was not a plea, only a fact he placed on the table in the way an honest man always places the truth on the table, even when it's inconvenient. Payne lifted an eyebrow slightly, as though surprised that anyone would bring up something so irrelevant. "We all have families, Abel," Payne said gently. "That doesn't stop people from betraying." Marsh kept looking down at the water. "Get him out of the city," he said at last, his voice no louder than the rain that had once struck the tin awning of the hospital. "Tonight. And don't make me hear about this again." No one in the room asked another question, because there was no need, because that order was already an ending in itself, and whatever happened to Halloran afterward was never spoken of in that room. All anyone knew was that by the next morning his name had disappeared from every assignment board, every list, as though he had never existed in the organization at all. Payne gathered the books, smiled with satisfaction, and said Marsh had done the right thing. That decisiveness was what kept everything running smoothly. But after Payne had left, Abel lingered, looking at Marsh with the eyes of a man who wanted to say something and then chose not to. "Have you been sleeping lately?" Abel asked, and that strange question made Marsh turn back to look at him. "I ask because you've stayed in the office 3 nights in a row," Abel continued. "People don't stay in the office 3 nights in a row if they sleep well at home." Marsh didn't answer, and inside that silence was something he would not admit to anyone. that for the past 3 nights, every time he closed his eyes, he saw an underground parking garage, a slender woman stepping forward instead of back, and a sentence turning over and over in his mind, that somewhere out there was someone who had given his money back and demanded the one thing no one in his entire life had ever dared demand from him: the truth. The following week, when Delaney went to the hospital's financial desk to ask for an extension on the medical bill she had been paying off little by little for nearly 2 years, the clerk behind the counter looked at the screen, then lifted her eyes in confusion and said there was no longer any debt under Delaney's name, that the full amount had been paid 3 days earlier by a third party who had left no name. Delaney stood motionless in front of the counter for a long while, still holding the notebook where she had written down numbers she knew by heart to the last cent. And she knew at once who had done it, knew it in the way people know something they don't want to believe. She asked more questions, and the clerk accidentally mentioned that it wasn't only her balance, but also the pediatric care program where she worked in the mornings. The program that had been so underfunded it had been forced to cut back even on medicine, had just received a donation large enough to keep it running for an entire year, also from an anonymous source, also 3 days earlier. That afternoon, Delaney didn't go home. She found a way to make contact, leaving a message through exactly the person she guessed would be able to get it where it needed to go. And that evening, a car stopped in front of the hospital, the door opened, and the man whose wound she had once stitched stepped out, standing beneath the streetlight, no longer pale as he had been on that rainy night, but restored to the bearing of a man, accustomed to making others lower their voices. "You paid me," Delaney said, going straight to the point without a greeting. "My bill and the pediatric wards. You did it without asking me a single question." The man didn't deny it. "I paid a debt," he answered. "You saved me, and I don't like owing anyone. This is how I balance things." Delaney shook her head, and in her voice there was a toughness he had heard once in the underground garage, through someone else's report, but had never faced directly. "This isn't balance," she said. "This is you using money to buy back a good feeling for yourself. You pay a huge amount with nothing but a signature, without blinking, then you go home and sleep well because you think you've just done something kind. But charity like that isn't for the person receiving it, it's for the person giving it. It lets you see yourself as a good man without having to change anything about who you truly are." The sentence hung suspended between them in the cold evening air, and the man didn't answer right away, not with the anger he usually showed when someone dared say such things to him, but only looked at her for a long while, with the gaze of a man trying to understand a kind of person he had never encountered in his world. "The pediatric ward," he said at last, and his voice slowed, losing its familiar authority. "That wasn't so I could sleep well. There are children there who have no one to pay for them, and I know exactly what it feels like to be a child with no one standing up to pay for anything on your behalf." Delaney went still, because that wasn't the answer she had been expecting. Not a defense, not an excuse, but a rare piece of truth falling out of a man who clearly wasn't used to revealing anything about himself. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw that beneath that armor there was something not entirely made of ice. "And what about mine?" she asked, her voice a little softer now. "You hesitated before giving your real name," he answered, and the corner of his mouth lifted into something almost like a smile. "That night, you said you would collect the truth from me, not money. I paid with money because I know how to pay with money. The truth is harder, and I'm not ready yet. So for now, consider this an advance payment on the debt I truly owe you." Delaney was silent, and she understood that she couldn't return that hospital payment, couldn't refuse the money that had saved an entire program full of children who needed medicine, that this time her pride had to yield to something larger than itself. "Fine," she said. "I won't give it back because there are children who need that money more than they need my pride. But listen carefully. I'm still not accepting your money for myself. My medical bill, I'll pay you back, every cent, however long it takes." The man looked at her, and something in his eyes changed, a new kind of respect that even he couldn't yet name. "You're the first person in many years who has demanded to pay money back to me," he said. "Most people only try to take more." Then he turned and walked back toward the car, pausing for a beat before opening the door, and said without turning around that those children in the pediatric ward deserved to have someone care for them with hands like hers. And the car rolled away into the darkness. leaving Delaney standing there, with the feeling that the man she had just spoken to was far more complicated than the world he ruled. Morning in the pediatric ward of St. Meridian Hospital was the part of the day Delaney looked forward to most, not because it was easier than the night shift, but because Cora was there. The 8-year-old girl who had been hospitalized long enough to know every nurse's name by heart, and long enough for Delaney to know by heart the way the girl tilted her head whenever she was thinking. Cora had lost her mother before she ever came here, and in her file, in the space marked family contact, there was only a blank no one had been able to fill in, but Cora didn't talk much about that. She only had her own way of filling the long mornings, and this morning that way was a neat stack of square-colored paper spread across her blanket. "Can you teach me how to fold this?" Cora asked, holding out a half-folded sheet she simply couldn't finish, and Delaney pulled a chair down beside the bed, took the paper and began folding from the beginning with slow creases the girl could follow. "Look," she said, "fold it in half, then open it, then fold the corner in." And as Delaney folded, she softly hummed an old melody her mother had once sung, a song with no clear words, only drift notes moving through the air. And Cora stopped her hands to listen, her wide eyes fixed on Delaney without blinking. "You have a beautiful singing voice," the girl said when Delaney stopped, and Delaney let out a quiet laugh, saying it had been a very long time since she had sung for anyone, that maybe she had forgotten she ever knew how to sing at all. The crane slowly took shape beneath her hands, its wings spreading, its neck lifting, and when she placed it in Cora's small palm, the girl looked at it as though she had been handed something far more precious than a folded piece of paper. "Can it fly?" Cora asked, and Delaney said it flew in its own way, that some things didn't need to leave the ground to be called flying. Just then, there was a soft knock at the doorframe, and an older man stood there, holding a paper bag, wearing the slightly awkward look of someone unused to stepping into places filled with children's laughter. And Delaney recognized him at once. It was Abel, the quiet man who had stood silently in the background of the world she had only touched at one corner. He didn't explain why he had come. He simply stepped in, set the paper bag on the edge of the bed, and inside were a set of colored pencils and several small wooden toys, the plain, old-fashioned kind people rarely saw for sale anymore, chosen by someone who didn't know much about children but had tried. "For me," Cora asked, and Abel nodded, sitting down in the chair at the corner of the room, with the shy caution of a man afraid of taking up too much space. The girl wasted no time on politeness. She immediately spread out the colored pencils and asked him what color he liked best, and Abel, who had spent his whole life in a world where questions usually carried danger, stared for a moment at that simple question before answering that he liked the blue of the lake early in the morning. Cora nodded gravely as though that were a very important answer, then began to draw, and Abel sat still, watching her, and something softened on his weathered face, a tenderness perhaps no one had seen there in a very long time. Delaney stood by the window watching the two of them, the old man and the little girl, and she said nothing to break the moment. "Do you have grandchildren?" Cora asked without looking up from the paper, and Abel was silent for a beat before answering that he once had a family, a long time ago, and his voice dropped in a way that made Delaney understand that behind those 4 words, a long time ago, there was an entire story he would not tell. But Cora didn't ask more. She only pushed the paper crane toward him and said he should keep it, so it could fly home with him. And Abel took the crane in both his calloused hands far too large for something so delicate, looked at it for a long time, then carefully slipped it into his breast pocket as though afraid of breaking one wing. When he stood to say goodbye, he paused beside Delaney at the doorway, and he said quietly, softly enough for only her to hear, that it had been a very long time since he had sat in a room without having to guard against anything, that the little girl had something the whole of their organization put together could never buy. Then he left, leaving behind the sound of colored pencils rolling across paper, and Delaney's soft humming rising again. And in that rare, peaceful morning, none of the 3 of them knew that the days ahead would make them remember this small pool of light forever. A few days later, during an afternoon shift in the long-term care ward for the elderly, Delaney was assigned to care for a newly transferred patient, an old woman past 80 with snow-white hair and eyes that shifted between clarity and cloudiness with the waves of age and illness. The old woman's name was Margaret, and most of the time she drifted between the present and years that had passed long ago, calling out the names of people who weren't in the room, asking about events that had ended decades earlier. Delaney was used to that. She knew how to walk with patients into their memories instead of dragging them out cruelly, so when Margaret took her hand while she was adjusting the pillow, Delaney only smiled and left her hand resting inside the old woman's trembling one. But then the old woman looked at her, looked very closely at her face beneath the afternoon light spilling through the window, and something lit up in those clouded eyes, a recognition so tender it sent a chill down the spine. "Eleanor," the old woman called, her voice full of joy, as though she were seeing a loved one again after years apart. "Eleanor, you finally came to visit me. I thought you were angry with me about what happened that day." Delaney froze in the middle of the room, the hand holding the pillow suddenly stiff, because the name that had just been spoken was not some random name, not one of the hundreds of names confused patients mistakenly called out every day. Eleanor was her mother's name, a name she hadn't heard anyone say aloud in many years, a name she kept in a deep place inside herself where she rarely allowed herself to reach. She turned back to the old woman, trying to keep her voice normal, and asked softly who she had just called. "Eleanor, of course," Margaret replied, smiling as she patted the back of Delaney's hand. "Don't tease your mother. I'd know you anywhere. You still have the eyes from back then, the eyes that look straight at people and refuse to lower themselves." Delaney felt her heart beating faster, a feeling she couldn't name, half confusion, half a cold curiosity slowly rising inside her. She sat down on the edge of the bed, let go of the pillow, and tried to ask more in the gentlest voice she had, asking how Margaret and Eleanor knew each other, where they had met. But Margaret's eyes began to cloud again, the fog of old age drifting back to cover the brief moment of clarity that had just appeared, and she became confused, asking Delaney whether it was time for tea yet, and why the sky had grown dark so early today. Delaney tried to bring her back, repeating the name Eleanor once more in a very soft voice, and in one last fleeting second before slipping fully into confusion, the old woman tightened her grip on Delaney's hand and whispered that she had always regretted it, that she should have told the truth sooner, that what happened to Eleanor wasn't what people had been told at all. Then she let go, rested her head back against the pillow, and began humming a wordless melody, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as though she were looking toward someplace very far away. Delaney sat motionless beside the bed for a long time, not knowing how long she had been sitting there, only knowing that the words she had just heard kept echoing again and again inside her mind. What happened to Eleanor wasn't what people had been told. She had grown up with one version of the story, a version she had never dared to question, because questioning it meant reopening a wound she had spent her entire youth trying to close. But now, from the mouth of a confused old woman she had met for the first time, a door she thought had been locked tight had suddenly opened a crack. She told herself it was only the rambling of an old woman, that Margaret had mistaken her for someone else, that there were countless people in the world named Eleanor, but the old woman's eyes when she recognized her had not been the eyes of someone making a mistake, and the regret in her voice was not something a person could invent. Delaney stood, adjusted the blanket over the old woman, who had begun to doze, and before leaving the room, she stopped at the threshold and looked back at the gentle face sinking into sleep, wondering who this woman had been in her mother's life, and why no one had ever mentioned her in all these years. She didn't know that the question rising in her mind that night would be the first thread, and once she pulled it free, an entire curtain she had believed was the truth would begin to unravel, seam by seam. The question about her mother was still hanging in Delaney's mind when Sullivan Marsh stopped by the pediatric ward on a weekend morning, this time not with an anonymous signature, but in person, coming to see how the program he had funded was actually running, and with him was Wesley Payne, the man who managed the numbers for the entire organization. Delaney stood in the hallway, watching the two men pass through the patient rooms, and she noticed Payne the way a nurse accustomed to observing patients noticed things, searching for the small signs other people missed. Payne smiled at every child, praised every drawing taped to the wall, told Marsh that this was a meaningful investment, that he had done something wonderful, and every sentence he spoke landed in the right place, at the right moment, so smoothly that no one could possibly object. But that very smoothness troubled Delaney, because in all her years working beside people who were about to lose their lives, she had learned that sincere people rarely spoke with such polished ease. When Marsh stopped at the end of the hallway, Payne excused himself to step outside and take a call, and Delaney seized the moment when only the two of them remained to move closer to him. "That man," she said quietly, nodding toward the door Payne had just walked through. "He agrees with you about everything." Marsh looked at her, slightly surprised by an opening so direct. "Wesley is the man I trust most," he answered. "He's been with me for years and has never disappointed me." "That's exactly what worries me," Delaney said. "Have you ever heard him tell you something you didn't want to hear? Have you ever seen him frown, disagree, tell you that you were wrong?" Marsh was silent for a beat, and inside that silence was the answer he didn't want to admit. "That's called loyalty," he said at last, his voice hardening a little. Delaney slowly shook her head. "No," she replied, her voice low but every word clear. "Loyalty isn't nodding. A dog nods at you because you feed it. A truly loyal person is someone who dares to stand in front of you and say you're wrong, even knowing you might take your anger out on them, because they care more about you than they care about keeping their place beside you. A person who only knows how to agree isn't protecting you. He's protecting his position. And someday, when keeping that position requires him to sell you out, how surprised will you be when you discover that the man who always nodded at you also nodded at your enemies?" The words made Marsh turn fully to look at her, and across a face that wasn't used to revealing anything, a flicker of unease passed before he immediately forced it down. "You've only met Wesley once," he said. "You don't know him." "I don't need to know him," Delaney answered. "I only need to watch the way he smiles. I've sat beside the beds of many people in their final hours, and do you know who comes to visit them? Not the people who always told them they were right. The ones who come are the people who once argued with them, who once made them angry, who once said straight to their faces the things they didn't want to hear. Because real affection is sometimes uncomfortable, while anything too pleasant is usually being performed." Marsh didn't answer right away. He looked down the hallway, where morning sunlight stretched across the floor, where the laughter of children drifted from the patient rooms, and for a moment he seemed to weigh what she had said, to weigh the possibility that this woman, the one who had never been afraid of him, might be seeing something his entire machinery of caution had missed. But then Payne returned, stepping back into the hallway with his permanent smile, apologizing for being away so long, saying that everything was settled, and that familiar composure seemed to wipe away the hesitation that had just begun to form in Marsh. "Let's go," he said to Payne, then turned to Delaney with a short nod, thanked her for taking care of the children, and before walking away, he paused long enough to add that she should worry about her work and let him worry about his people. Delaney didn't argue further. She only watched the two men leave the pediatric ward, watched the way Payne leaned slightly toward Marsh as they walked, the posture of someone who was always close beside him, yet always half a step behind, and a quiet unease settled inside her, the feeling of someone who had just seen a crack no one else had noticed, a crack she knew would one day spread into something beyond repair. Delaney's warning had barely had time to settle before the numbers at the harbor began speaking in their own way. One afternoon, Marsh received a report that a shipment had left the port, but the amount recorded did not match its true value. With a difference large enough that it could not be brushed aside as a clerical error, and when he had his people review the previous months, similar discrepancies began appearing one after another, insignificant when taken separately, but together forming a steady stream leaking out of the organization without anyone being able to trace the source. Marsh summoned Payne, placed the reports on the table, and asked what he thought of it. Payne picked up each page and studied it with the focused expression of a doctor reading test results, frowning just enough, sighing at just the right moment, then said that someone inside was quietly siphoning money out in a sophisticated way, that the trail had been hidden very skillfully, and that he needed time to track down whoever was behind it. "Let me handle this quietly," Payne said in his familiar, reassuring voice. "You have bigger things to worry about. Leave the books to me. I'll find the traitor and bring you the evidence." Marsh looked at the man who had stood beside him for so many years, the man who had never once given him reason to doubt, and he nodded, handing over the entire file along with access to accounts that only a very small number of people in the organization were allowed to touch. "I trust you, Wesley," he said. "You're the only person I can give this to without worrying." And in that very moment, when the office door closed behind Payne, the tragedy was sealed, because the man Marsh had entrusted completely to hunt for the traitor was the traitor himself. In his private office, beneath the late-night light, Payne opened those folders not to search for anyone, but to continue a structure he had been quietly building for years. He was not in a hurry, had never been in a hurry, because patience was his sharpest weapon. He rearranged the numbers so every missing stream of money would lead back to one single point, and that point was not him but Marsh. He created shell companies with names so dull no one would bother to question them, contracts that seemed legal on the surface, but hid beneath them transfers designed, so that one day, when someone followed the trail, everything would point back to his boss. And the final link, the thing he had spent an entire decade sharpening, was Marsh's signature. Payne placed a sheet with Marsh's real signature in front of him, then beside it the version he had written by hand, and he compared every stroke, every break, every slant, until the two signatures were almost impossible to tell apart. This was work he had practiced in the dark for so long that his hand could now recreate another person's writing as easily as writing his own name, and each time his pen came down, he placed that false signature on a new document, inserting it exactly where it needed to be in the flow of paperwork, turning his own boss into the mastermind behind the very things he was doing. No hatred showed on Payne's face as he worked, no triumph, only the cold composure of a man who had decided long ago that the loyalty he displayed every day was only a coat, and when the time came, he would take it off without the slightest hesitation. He remembered what the woman in the pediatric ward had said to Marsh, that line about people who only knew how to nod, and for a moment he felt irritated, not because she was wrong, but because she was dangerously right, because she had seen what no one in this organization had managed to see for all these years. He memorized that face, that name, and told himself that a woman who dared to speak such words would need to be watched, that she was a variable he would not allow himself to overlook. Then he folded the files, put them back exactly where they belonged, turned off the light, and stepped outside with the calm smile that Marsh's entire world still believed was the face of devotion. That same night, on the other side of the city, Marsh sat alone in his office looking down at the black water of the lake, believing that his most trusted man was working day and night to find the person who had betrayed him, never knowing that with each passing day, the trap around him was tightening another turn, woven by the very hand he had held most firmly in trust. The name Eleanor would not leave Delaney alone, and after that shift she went back to her small apartment, pulled from the bottom of the closet the box she hadn't opened in years, the box that held the few things left of her mother, a handful of old photographs gone yellow with time, a silver bracelet, and a stack of papers she had never been brave enough to read carefully when she was young. She had grown up with a familiar story, that her mother had died in an accident when Delaney was too little to remember her face, an accident her relatives always spoke of in rushed voices before turning quickly to something else. And for all those years she had accepted that version because it was easier than digging. But Margaret's words, that what happened to Eleanor wasn't what people had been told, had opened a crack inside her, and that night she sat on the floor, spread the old papers out in front of her, and read them again with the eyes of an adult instead of the child she had once been. Among the documents was a copy of a report she had never noticed, stating that her mother, Eleanor Rourke, had worked as an accountant for a transport company in the Harbor District in the years before she died, and that she had passed away not long after that company became caught in an investigation into money of unclear origin. Delaney read the company's name again and again, a dull name she had never heard mentioned, and a cold feeling began rising inside her when she realized that the Harbor District was the very place controlled by the man whose life she had just saved. She opened her computer, typed in the company's name, followed one old link after another, one article after another that time had pushed all the way to the bottom, and piece by piece, the fragments began forming a picture she did not want to see. The company where her mother had worked had once been a link in the network controlled by the Marsh family, and the investigation from all those years ago, the investigation in which her mother had perhaps known too much, had closed with suspicious quiet right after Eleanor died. No one was charged, no one was pursued, and everything sank into silence as though nothing had ever happened. Delaney sat motionless for a long time, gripping the paper so tightly it wrinkled beneath her fingers, and inside her a storm was rising with nowhere to go. The man whose wound she had stitched on that rainy night, the man who had paid her hospital bill and saved an entire program full of children, the man she had begun to believe might have something not entirely cruel beneath that armor of ice, was also the man at the head of the world that may have taken her mother from her. She stood, pacing back and forth in the cramped room, then began gathering things. She took out the file about the hospital bill Marsh had paid for her, found the notebook where she had calculated how she would repay him every cent, and she meant to wrap it all up, to return everything, to cut every tie with that man before her gratitude became a betrayal of the very mother, whose face she had never had the chance to remember. She stuffed the papers into a bag, her hands shaking from anger and pain, and she had already gone to the door, had already placed her hand on the knob, when that hand stopped. She stood there with her forehead resting against the cold door, and a question kept ringing in her mind that she could not push away. Whether that man had truly been the one who caused what happened all those years ago, or whether he had only happened to inherit the empire someone else had used to kill her mother. Margaret had said she should have told the truth sooner, had said what happened was not what people had been told, and if the story of her mother's death itself had been twisted all these years, then how could Delaney allow herself to rush into condemning a person based on another half-truth? Delaney let the bag drop to the floor. She sank down beside it, wrapped her arms around her knees, and for the first time in many years she allowed herself to cry, not the tears of weakness, but the crying of someone who had just realized that the grief she thought had closed long ago had never truly been closed the right way. She had spent her whole youth not asking, not digging, accepting a version that was easier to bear, and now a confused old woman had accidentally pulled the curtain back. When the last of her tears had dried, Delaney wiped her face and picked up the bag, but instead of carrying it to the door to return it all and walk away, she placed it back in the closet, because she understood that if she left now, she would never know the truth, and after all those years of living with an unfinished story, the one thing she could no longer endure was continuing not to know. She would stay, not because of gratitude, not because she had forgiven, but because she needed to find out who had truly caused her mother's death, and this time she would not let anyone twist the truth ever again. The decision to stay led Delaney into a string of sleepless nights, and she began tracing the name of the transport company, where her mother had once worked with the patience of someone used to fitting tiny pieces together into a larger picture. She went back to visit Margaret many times, sitting by her bed in the rare moments when the old woman's mind cleared again, and little by little, through the broken fragments of Margaret's stories, she gathered names, events that no official document had ever recorded. Margaret had once worked in the same accounting office as her mother, and she remembered that Eleanor had discovered something in the books, an improper stream of money, a forged signature, and that she had meant to bring it into the light. Delaney listened, took notes, compared it all with the old papers in her mother's box, and each time one link clicked into place, her heart tightened. She had entered this search with the almost certain belief that the man who ruled the harbor, the man to whom she was indebted, was the one responsible, and she had prepared herself to hate him, to turn her gratitude into anger. But when she followed the thread to its end, what appeared before her was not what she had been waiting for. In a copy of an old document Margaret had kept hidden all these years inside an old Bible, the book she had asked someone to bring to the hospital for her, one name appeared again and again beside the questionable payments her mother had uncovered, and that name was not Marsh. It belonged to a much younger man at the time, a rising finance employee, the person who had signed for and moved the funds that later became part of the investigation, a man named Wesley Payne. Delaney sat stunned before that name, the paper trembling slightly in her hand, because she knew at once who he was. He was the man with the composed smile she had warned Marsh about, the man who always nodded, the man she had sensed something wrong with from the very first time she met him in the pediatric ward. She read it again, checked it again, afraid she was seeing what she wanted to see instead of the truth, but every piece pointed in the same direction. In the years when her mother was still alive, Payne had been the one directly manipulating the money flow inside that company. And when Eleanor's discovered what he was doing, when she planned to bring everything into the light, she died, and the investigation closed in silence. Marsh at that time had not even taken control of the entire network yet. He was only the man who would later inherit the empire that men like Payne had used to conceal their own crimes. The man she was indebted to was not the one who had taken her mother from her. That man was the one she had seen through from the beginning, the one standing close beside Marsh with false devotion. The one she now understood was not only plotting against his own boss, but was also the hand that had caused the loss that shaped her entire life. Delaney set the paper down, and inside her, two currents she had thought opposed to each other suddenly merged into one. She had been searching for the truth about her mother, and she had begun to realize that the man she had saved was being trapped by the very person he trusted most. Now she understood that those two things were not two separate roads, but the same road, that exposing the man who had destroyed her mother and saving the man being pushed toward prison were one and the same act, aimed at the same person. What rose inside her was no longer the painful tearing of the nights before, but something clear and cold, a clarity she had not felt since opening her mother's box. She no longer had to choose between gratitude and justice, no longer had to choose between the living and the dead. She only had to do one thing, and that was to drag Wesley Payne into the light, and once she did, she would at the same time restore innocence to the man who had saved the children in the pediatric ward, and return justice to the mother whose face she never had the chance to remember. Delaney gathered the documents, this time not to hide them in a closet and walk away, but to begin a new file, one of her own. She understood that the road ahead would be dangerous, that Payne was a man who had hidden his crimes for years without anyone discovering them, an opponent more patient and more subtle than anyone she had ever faced. But for the first time since that rainy night at the hospital's back door, Delaney knew exactly what she had to do, and in her eyes, the gaze of someone who had once only known how to lower her head and stitch other people's wounds, now carried the cold, enduring light of a person determined to follow the truth to its end, whatever the cost might be. While Delaney began building her own file in the dark, the trap Payne had patiently woven over so many years had finally tightened enough for him to pull the strings. One morning, before Marsh had even left his office, law enforcement officers appeared with all the proper paperwork, and they read him a list of accusations so long that even he went still, charges involving money laundering, fraud, and the movement of illegal funds through a series of shell companies. Marsh stood still and let them do their work. He didn't resist, didn't raise his voice, because he understood clearly that fighting back in that moment would only make everything worse. But inside him was a confusion he had never tasted before, because the evidence they presented was not some clumsy fabrication, but a body of documents arranged so perfectly that even he, looking at it, could almost believe he had done those things. When he was taken to the station and sat across from the prosecutors, they placed one document after another in front of him, and on many of those pages was his own signature, or something that looked exactly like his signature down to every stroke, approving transactions he had never made, authorizing funds he had never seen. He demanded to see where the evidence had come from, and the answer chilled him, because everything had been provided voluntarily, neatly, in such clean order that it was suspicious, as though someone had prepared this entire case long ago, and had only been waiting for the right moment to hand it over to the prosecution like a carefully wrapped gift. Marsh didn't have to be especially brilliant to understand that the only person with enough access to every number, every account, every signature, to build such a complete file was the very person to whom he himself had handed everything, the person he had told, "I trust you," without needing to worry. But when he spoke the name Wesley Payne, when he tried to explain that this was a trap, the prosecutors only looked at him with the eyes of people who had heard too many guilty men blame someone else, and they presented a statement from Payne himself, who had voluntarily cooperated with the investigation, playing the role of an honest subordinate heartbroken to discover his boss had broken the law and forced to do the right thing. Released on bail only through an amount of money that even his frozen assets struggled to manage, Marsh returned, and what was waiting for him was more bitter than the accusations themselves. The empire he had spent his whole life building began to fall apart before his eyes, not with one thunderous collapse, but through quiet, empty spaces. The people who used to lower their heads when he entered a room no longer answered his calls. Those who once competed to stand closest to him in meetings now found every possible reason to be absent. The harbor he had once controlled so tightly now operated as though he had never existed. Partners quietly changed direction. Subordinates disappeared one by one, each with a reason, each with his own escape route, and all of them left behind the same thing: the silence of people who had decided that loyalty was only worth something when it demanded no price. Marsh sat alone in the office that had once always been filled with people coming and going, now so empty that the sound of his own footsteps echoed back at him, and he recognized a bitter truth, that the thing he had used to rule for years, fear, had never been loyalty at all. Fear only keeps people nearby as long as a band remains strong, and the moment he weakens, it pushes all of them away at once, because fear cannot tell the difference between a boss in trouble and prey dying on the ground. The only one who did not leave was Abel, the man who still came to the office every day as though nothing had changed, still poured him a glass of water, still stood quietly in the corner, and one evening, when the two of them sat in the empty room, Abel said softly that he didn't believe what people were accusing Marsh of, that he had stood beside him long enough to know the difference between the man he truly was and the thing others had drawn him to be. And Marsh looked at the old man, the only one still left, and in that moment something tightened inside his chest, not because the empire was collapsing, but because for the first time in his life, he understood the difference between those who surround a powerful man and one person who truly stays when the power is gone. The whole city now spoke his name with contempt. The newspapers shaped him into exactly the sinner the story needed, and not one among the hundreds of people who had once obeyed him stood up to say a word, not one except an old man pouring water in an empty room, and perhaps, somewhere in the city that Marsh did not yet know about, a woman quietly opening a file. Delaney came to Marsh's office late one evening, when nearly all the lights in the building had gone dark and only one window still glowed on the highest floor, and she stepped into a room that had once been full of people coming and going, now so empty that even the closing of the door sounded sharply clear. Marsh sat at his desk, the documents accusing him spread out in front of him, and he didn't look up right away. He only said quietly that he hadn't expected, of all the people he had ever known, that the person who would come to see him now would be her. Delaney set a box of food on the desk, something simple she had bought on the way over, the kind of meal chosen by someone who didn't have much to spare, and she said she guessed he hadn't eaten anything all day. Marsh looked at the food, then looked at her, and in his eyes there was a strange confusion, the confusion of a man unused to anyone worrying about him without expecting something in return. He didn't ask why she had come. He only said, in a voice so calm it was frightening, that he knew who had done this to him, that he had spent his entire career learning how to recognize traitors, and had still failed to see the one standing closest to him. "So what are you going to do?" Delaney asked, and she waited for the familiar answer of a man like him, a promise of revenge, a plan to crush the one who had harmed him. But Marsh only shook his head slowly. "Nothing," he said. "If I strike back the way I always have, I'll only prove that everything people say about me is true, and maybe it's time I stopped proving it." Delaney sat down in the chair across from him, and she looked at this man, the man the whole city now feared and despised at the same time, the man who had just lost everything he had once used to define himself, and she realized he didn't look like someone collapsing because power had slipped from his hands. "You don't regret losing the empire?" she asked softly. "You don't regret all the things you spent years building?" Marsh was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped, stripped of the authority she had always heard in it. "I used to think the thing I feared losing most was power," he said. "I lived my whole life believing that, did things I can't go back and erase, all just to hold on to it. But when everything began falling out of my hands, I sat in this empty room and realized I wasn't afraid of losing it. The only thing that keeps me awake at night is the thought that when all of this is over, there won't be a single person left in the world who can look at me and see a human being instead of a name that makes people lower their voices." The sentence settled into the quiet room, and Delaney felt something inside her chest loosen and sink, because those were not the words of a crime boss, but the words of a man lonely to the very core, a man who had built such a high wall around himself that now there was no one left inside it with him. She thought of the child he had once mentioned, the child who had no one to stand up and pay for anything on his behalf, and she understood that the man sitting before her had once been that child, had grown up by turning himself into something so strong that no one could hurt him anymore. And the price he had paid for that strength was that no one could reach him either. "You're wrong," Delaney said, and her voice was gentler than she had intended. "There are still people who look at you and see a human being. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here tonight." Marsh lifted his eyes to her, and in those eyes that had always seemed cold, something stirred faintly, a vulnerability he had hidden for so long that perhaps even he had forgotten he still possessed it. He didn't thank her, because he wasn't used to saying words like that, but he reached out and pulled the box of food closer, and that small gesture said more than any thank you could have. "You're not afraid of me," he said quietly, almost to himself. "From the very first night, you weren't afraid of me. I've never understood why." Delaney stood to leave, and before she walked out, she paused at the threshold and told him that some people spend their whole lives making others afraid of them, never realizing that what they truly longed for was never that fear, but one person brave enough to stay even when there was no reason left to be afraid. Then she stepped out, leaving the man sitting alone in the empty room with a still warm box of food, and for the first time in weeks, Marsh did not feel completely alone. It was Abel who came looking for Delaney, not the other way around, and he did it in the quiet manner of a man used to moving through darkness without drawing anyone's notice. One afternoon, he waited for her in the hospital parking garage, the very place where Marsh's men had once come to threaten her. But this time the man standing there carried nothing with him except weariness and a resolve she recognized at once. He said plainly that he knew she was trying to help Marsh, that he had noticed her coming and going, that in the whole world that had turned its back on his boss, he believed she was the only person left who truly wanted to find the truth. "I've been beside him for many years," Abel said, his voice low and slow. "I know he's done things that can't be forgiven, but what people are putting on him now he didn't do. I know who did, and I'm too old to keep being silent." From that day on, two people no one would have expected began working together, a poor nurse and an old man, who had once stood in the shadow of power, each bringing the half the other did not have. Delaney had the old documents about her mother's case, had the thread leading to Payne, while Abel had something more valuable than anything else: access to the closed world where Payne still walked every day with false devotion. He knew what Payne hid and where he hid it, knew which meetings took place behind closed doors, knew how to move through the building without anyone paying attention to an old man who had become such a familiar part of the scenery that he was almost invisible. That invisibility became his weapon. For weeks, Abel watched patiently, remembered, and little by little gathered the pieces Delaney needed: copies of documents, traces showing that Payne himself was the one moving the money, strands tying that name to both the case unfolding now and the matter from years ago. But the most important piece, the one Abel knew would change everything, was Payne's own voice. One evening, when Payne stayed late and believed he was alone in the office area, Abel stood outside a door, left slightly open, and quietly recorded Payne's conversation with someone he had called. A conversation in which Payne, believing no one could hear him, said in his own voice the things he had never dared admit to anyone, about how he had built the entire case, how the signature had been forged, and even about a name from the past he thought he had buried long ago. Abel held on to that recording as though holding something fragile, telling no one except Delaney, and when he handed it to her, his hand trembled slightly, not because he was afraid, but because he understood the weight of what he was holding. "Keep this safe," he said. "This is the only thing that can save him, and it's also the most dangerous thing you've ever held in your hands." In the midst of those tense days, Abel still refused to give up one habit. He still stopped by the pediatric ward to visit Cora whenever he could, bringing her sometimes a new box of colors, sometimes a comic book, sitting quietly in the corner while he listened to her talk about the pictures she drew. Once, Delaney found him sitting there, carefully holding in his large palm the paper crane Cora had given him long before, the crane now slightly wrinkled, but still guarded by him like a treasure, and she understood that this old man, who had spent his whole life in a cold world, had found in that child something that softened the barren places in his heart. He told Delaney once, quietly, that he had once had a family long ago, and that when he sat beside Cora, it felt as though he were being allowed to live again, inside a moment he had thought was lost forever. Delaney didn't ask more. She only let him have those peaceful afternoons, because she understood that there are wounds people never speak of, but that still need a place to heal. On the night before everything changed, Abel stopped by the door of the pediatric ward, looked at Cora sleeping through the glass, then turned to Delaney and said that, whatever happened next, he hoped she would promise to watch over the girl, that some children deserved to grow up without ever knowing the darkness people like him had lived in all their lives. Delaney promised, not knowing that it was the last promise she would ever make to him, and that the old man smiling with the paper crane in his hand was about to pay the highest price for the honesty he had never been allowed to have in his life. Wesley Payne was not a man easily fooled, and the patience that had helped him build an entire perfect trap was also what helped him sense when something around him had begun moving out of place. He started noticing small details, a file that was not where it should have been, a door that should have been locked, and most of all, the quiet presence of the old man he had for so long considered a harmless part of the scenery. Payne realized that Abel had been too close at moments when no one should have been close, that those seemingly tired eyes had seen more than he had imagined, and for a man who had hidden his crimes for so many years, that possibility alone was a danger he could not allow to remain. What happened afterward did not unfold before Delaney's eyes, and she learned of it only through a phone call near dawn, the hour when a ringing phone always seemed to carry terrible news. The person on the other end told her Abel was gone, that he had been found in circumstances arranged to look like an accident of old age, neat and leaving no questions for anyone who did not want to ask them. Delaney stood still in her small kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, and for one long moment she could not say anything, could not cry out, only stand there while the world around her seemed to stop. She set the phone down very slowly, as though any sharper movement would make what she had just heard become real. She thought of the man who had waited for her in the parking garage, the man who had said he was too old to keep being silent, the man who had carefully held the wrinkled paper crane in his calloused palm as though holding a piece of something he had lost long ago. She thought of the promise she had given him only a few nights before, the promise to watch over Cora, and she understood at once that he had sensed something, that when he asked her for that promise, he had known he was walking down a road with no way back. Delaney sat down in a chair, both hands resting on the tabletop, and she remained there in the gray light of dawn, letting the grief quietly rise and pass through her without sound, because some losses are so large that tears are not enough to contain them. But in that very silence, she remembered what Abel had given her before he died. Before that fateful day, he had handed her the recording of Payne's voice along with the final pieces of evidence, had told her to keep them very safe, and now Delaney understood why his hand had trembled when he gave them to her. She understood that he had placed in her hands not only proof, but the final legacy of his life. She stood, went to the place where she had hidden those things, opened it, checked everything again, and when Payne's calm voice sounded softly through the quiet room, that voice confessing everything he had done, Delaney clenched her hand, and the pain inside her began turning into something else, harder and more enduring. The man who had sacrificed himself to give her this could not be allowed to die for nothing, and she swore to the empty room that she would bring it into the light no matter what price had to be paid. During the days that followed, Delaney still went to the pediatric ward every morning as usual, still sat beside Cora, still smiled at the girl and listened to her stories about her drawings, and not once did she let the child know that the gentle man who often brought her colors was gone. When Cora asked why he had not come lately, Delaney only said softly that he was on a long trip, and she kept her voice light and warm, swallowing everything that was tearing her apart inside, because she had promised Abel that she would keep the girl's childhood untouched by darkness, and that was a promise she was determined not to break. The girl nodded, believing her, then bent back over the picture she had not finished coloring, and Delaney sat there watching the small hand move across the page, keeping a smile on her lips while her heart quietly broke into pieces. That night, after she had left the hospital, she finally allowed herself to stop in the empty parking garage, lean back against her old car, and let the last of her tears fall for the man who had become the closest thing to a father she had ever had. The man who had taught her that honesty was sometimes the most expensive thing a human being could choose. Before her grief had even begun to ease, a new trial came crashing down, and this time it came from the place where Delaney had the least ability to defend herself, the small room in the pediatric ward where Cora lay. One morning, when Delaney walked in as usual, she knew at once that something was wrong. The girl's cheeks were paler, her eyes more tired, and the test results the doctors gave afterward confirmed what the instinct of a longtime nurse had already whispered to her. Cora's condition had worsened, and for her to have a chance at recovery, she needed an intensive course of treatment, something beyond the reach of a child with no family member listed, no one to pay for her. A cost so large it rose before Delaney like a wall that could not be climbed. She sat in the doctor's office, listening as they explained the options, the time that was running out, the fact that the hospital had done all it could, but there were still limits kindness alone could not break through, and she felt the ground sway beneath her feet. For many nights afterward, Delaney lived between two battlefronts pulling her tight in opposite directions. By day, she stayed beside Cora, keeping her face calm and warm, reading stories to her, folding more paper cranes with her, softly singing old melodies whenever the girl had trouble sleeping, doing everything within her power so the child would not feel the fear tightening around her. She never let Cora see her exhaustion, never let a single tear fall in front of the girl, because she had promised herself and the man who was gone that she would keep this child's small world sheltered from every shadow. "Are you scared?" Cora asked once, her large eyes looking at Delaney with that sensitivity children sometimes have. And Delaney took that tiny hand, smiled, and said she wasn't afraid, because she knew for certain that Cora's crane would still fly very far, for a very long time. At night, after leaving the hospital, Delaney sat at the small table in her apartment, spreading out before her the documents about Marsh's case, the recording Abel had traded his life to obtain, the old papers about her mother, and she fitted them together little by little, building a file strong enough to stand in a courtroom. She worked until her eyes blurred from lack of sleep, until the lines of text smeared in front of her, because she understood that time was racing against her on both fronts, that every passing day brought Cora closer to that fragile border, and brought Marsh closer to the day an unjust sentence would be handed down. There were nights when she collapsed over the table from exhaustion, and in those weak moments she wondered whether one person could carry this much, whether she was trying to save too many things at once and would end up losing them all. But then she thought of Cora's eyes, of her promise to Abel, of the man sitting alone in an empty room, waiting for a truth only she could bring him, and she would rise again and continue. Delaney went to Marsh and told him about Cora's condition, not to beg for anything, but because she needed someone with whom to share the burden pressing down on her shoulders. And Marsh listened in silence, his face revealing nothing, but when she finished, he asked only one question: how much the child needed and for how long. Delaney looked at him and said his assets were frozen, that he could barely take care of himself right now, that she had not come here to ask him for money. Marsh did not argue. He only said quietly that there were some things a person could still do even after losing almost everything, and that sometimes the final thing left to a man was the most important thing he had ever had. Delaney left his office that night without knowing exactly what he intended to do, carrying only a thin thread of hope through countless worries, and when she returned to Cora's bedside the next morning, sat down, took the girl's hand, and began folding a new crane with her, she tried to make her heart believe that somehow both lives she was struggling so hard to hold on to would be saved, that the sleepless nights, the hidden tears, and the price good people had paid would not become meaningless. 3 days after the night Delaney left Marsh's office carrying a fragile thread of hope, the manager of the pediatric care program came to her with news she did not dare believe at first. The cost of Cora's treatment had been fully arranged, not part of it, but all of it, enough to cover the entire intensive course the doctors had said was the girl's only chance. Delaney asked again and again where the money had come from, and the manager could only tell her that it came from the very fund that had quietly kept the program alive all this time. The fund no one could attach to any specific name, established long ago for exactly cases like this, children who had no one standing up to pay for anything on their behalf. Delaney stood motionless in the hallway, and inside her mind something quietly clicked into place, a thread connecting this moment to a distant evening, when a man standing beneath a streetlight had told her he knew exactly what it felt like to be a child with no one standing up to pay for anything on his behalf. She asked nothing more, made no attempt to confirm it, because some truths do not have to be spoken aloud to become clear, and she understood that the kindness one person had silently planted long ago, at a time when he did not yet know where it would bloom, was now returning to save one small life he had never even met. The weeks that followed became a stretch of days Delaney lived through with suspense tangled together with hope, sitting beside Cora's bed through each round of treatment, holding the girl's hand whenever she was tired, reading her the stories she loved, and every morning, when she woke, searching that small face for some sign of recovery. Cora was a child stronger than her small body suggested, and she received each round of treatment with a courage that softened even the most seasoned doctors, always asking Delaney, when she got better, whether she would be allowed to go outside and look at the lake, always talking about the things she would do when all of this passed, as though there had never been any room in her young heart for the thought that she might not make it through. And little by little, the girl's body began to answer. The test results slowly started moving in a better direction. Her pale cheeks gradually regained a trace of color. The tiredness in her eyes slowly gave way to the brightness of a child again. And then one morning, when Delaney walked into the room, she saw Cora sitting up in bed, folding a new paper crane by herself, and the girl looked up and smiled at her, a smile so radiant that Delaney had to turn away so the child would not see her eyes blurring. "The doctor says I'm getting better," Cora announced, holding up the paper crane she had not yet finished, and Delaney sat down beside her, took the crane from her small hands, helped her complete the final folds, and in that moment she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, the belief that not every story had to end in loss. She thought of Abel, the man who had asked her to promise she would watch over this child, and in silence she told him that she had kept her word, that the crane he had once cherished in his calloused palm was still flying, that the child he had loved would live and grow up in the light, never having to know the price the adults around her had quietly paid to preserve that childhood. When Cora was finally well enough to leave her hospital bed for a little while, Delaney led her to the large window at the end of the hallway, where they could see a piece of sky and the rooftops far away, and the girl pressed her small hand to the glass, gazing at the world outside with the eyes of someone who had just been given her future back. Delaney stood behind her, and she understood that this child's recovery was not some accidental miracle, but the result of a chain of kind choices joined one after another, one man planting goodness when no one had forced him to do so, one old man trading everything for the truth, and one promise kept whole through countless hardships. That circle had closed, not through any grand declaration, but through the smile of a child looking up at the sky she would soon be able to step into. With Cora past the worst of the danger, Delaney poured every bit of strength she had left into the second battlefront, and she understood that the documents she held, no matter how much weight they carried, would be useless if they were not brought before the court in the right way. She went to a young lawyer named Ruiz, a man who had once been her patient many years earlier, a man whose bedside she had sat beside, through nights when he had fought an illness that had seemed impossible to survive. Now, when she knocked on the door of his small office, he recognized her at once and said he still owed her something money could not repay. Ruiz worked in legal aid for people who could not afford attorneys, and when Delaney spread the recording and the file of documents in front of him, he went silent for a long while before lifting his eyes to her with a grave expression. "Do you know what you're holding in your hands?" he asked softly, and Delaney nodded, saying she knew, that she knew better than anyone the price that had been paid to obtain it. For many nights after that, the two of them sat together beneath the light in that cramped room, and Ruiz patiently taught her the things she needed to know, how a piece of evidence could be admitted or rejected, how testimony had to be given for it to carry legal weight, how to present a chain of events in a way that could persuade an entire courtroom that had already believed the verdict was decided. Delaney absorbed everything with the focus of someone who knew she had only one chance, taking notes, asking again, building and rebuilding each step of what she was about to do in her mind, until every piece was in its proper place. Ruiz told her that this road was dangerous, that she was preparing to face a man who had hidden his crimes for years without anyone tracing them, and that once she stepped into the courtroom with these things, there would be no turning back. Delaney only replied that she had gone too far to turn back, and that there were things a person, once knowing them, could no longer pretend never to have known. A few nights before the trial, Marsh came to see her, and this time there was something in his voice she had never heard before, almost a plea. He knew what she was doing, he said, and he wanted her to stop. The person who had gone after Abel would not hesitate to do the same to her, he said, and he could not allow one more person to pay the price because of him. He told her to give what she had to the lawyers and withdraw, to keep her name out of everything, to keep herself safe and let him handle the rest, even if that meant he had to bear a wrongful sentence. Delaney looked at him, and she saw clearly that his words were not meant to push her away, but came from a genuine fear, the fear of losing one of the few people left who still cared about him. But she shook her head. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her voice calm and firm. "A man gave his life to place this in my hands, and I won't betray that by hiding in the dark. A mother whose face I never had the chance to remember was robbed of the truth for all these years, and I won't let it be buried again. You want me to stay silent to keep myself safe, but I once chose not to stay silent on a night when silence would have been much easier, and I won't change now, when everything matters most." Marsh looked at her for a long time, and he understood that no words could move this woman, the woman who, from the very first night, had refused to take the easy thing in exchange for peace. He gave a slight nod, a quiet surrender mixed with something close to gratitude, and he said that if she insisted on taking this road, then he asked only one thing, that she come back whole, no matter how it ended. Delaney promised, and when she left that night, stepping out of his office into the cold darkness of the city, what she carried inside her was not fear, but the strange peace of someone who had finally found the thing she was willing to risk everything to protect. Tomorrow, the courtroom doors would open, and the woman the whole city had never bothered to notice would walk through them, carrying the truth that too many people had paid far too high a price to preserve. That morning, the courtroom of the downtown Central Courthouse had been packed from very early on, the public benches without a single empty seat, reporters crowding together with recorders and notebooks, and inside that noisy air, there was the cold eagerness of people who had come to witness a powerful man officially fall. The King of the Harbor, the name that for years had made people lower their voices, sat today at the defendant's table in a suit that no longer seemed to fit the way it once had, not because his body had changed, but because the man inside that suit had been worn down after months of taking one blow after another without being able to strike back. At the prosecution's table, everything carried the confidence of people certain they already held victory in their hands, the documents stacked neatly, the arguments sharpened, and seated in the witness row for the prosecution was Wesley Payne. Relaxed and composed in exactly the false devotion he had worn around himself for all those years, Payne sat there with his hands neatly placed on his knees, occasionally giving a slight nod as the prosecutor spoke, fully playing the part of an honest subordinate heartbroken to have to stand up and accuse his former boss. And not one person in the courtroom saw that behind that calm face was the man who had staged this entire performance. The prosecutor rose to deliver his closing argument in the tone of someone reading a sentence already written, going one by one through the evidence, the numbers, the signatures, and each sentence he spoke tightened the rope a little more around the neck of the man sitting silently at the defendant's table. Marsh did not react, did not interrupt, only sat staring straight ahead, because his lawyer had run out of options weeks ago, and he himself had already prepared his mind to receive what everyone in this courtroom believed was unavoidable. The judge was about to move into the final part of the trial, and in the still moment before the words that would decide a fate were spoken, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It was then that the great doors at the back of the room swung open. The sound of the doors opening rang out through the silence, making hundreds of heads turn at once, and across the threshold stepped a woman no one in that room recognized. A woman in plain clothes, her posture straight and steady, her arms holding a file pressed tightly against her chest, as though it weighed far more than paper truly could. She did not hurry, did not falter under the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her. She only walked with steady steps down the aisle between the 2 rows of benches, and in each step there was a calm that made the noisy courtroom fall silent with curiosity. Reporters whispered to one another, asking who this woman was. Court officers glanced at each other, unsure what was happening, and at the prosecution's table, confidence rippled for an instant with a wrinkle of confusion. But the most telling reactions came from 2 people. The first was Marsh, who had lifted his head by reflex like everyone else, and when his eyes met the face of the woman walking toward him, his whole body went slightly rigid, his lips parting as if to say something that never found its way into sound, because among all the people in the world he could have imagined appearing in the darkest hour of his life, he had never dared think it would be her, the woman who had once stitched his wound on a rainy night and had once pushed his money back to demand the truth. The second was Payne, and his reaction was far subtler but no less clear to anyone sharp enough to notice it. A very brief moment when the calm smile that always rested on his lips stopped. When those eyes that had always seemed composed narrowed for an instant, as though trying to remember where he had seen this woman before, and the first flicker of unease crossed a face that had revealed nothing for so many years. Delaney walked to the front of the courtroom, stopped, lifted her head, and faced the judge, and in that moment, beneath the white light of the courtroom, among hundreds of people waiting, the woman the whole city had never bothered to notice stood there with the file in her hands, ready to open the thing. Too many people had paid far too dearly for her to bring all the way here. Under the questioning gaze of the judge, Delaney spoke, her voice clear and loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, asking permission to present herself as a provider of new evidence directly related to the case, and beside her, Attorney Ruiz rose to confirm her legal standing, requesting that the court allow her to assist the defense. The prosecution immediately objected, arguing that this was an unusual last-minute interference, but the judge, after a moment of consideration, gave a light tap of her gavel and said she would allow it, partly because of procedure, partly because of the very human curiosity, to know what lay inside the file this woman had brought into the room at the decisive moment. Delaney stepped forward, placed the file on the table, and began not with eloquent words, but with the very thing this entire case had been built upon, the signatures. She pulled out the documents the prosecution had used as key evidence, pages bearing Marsh's signature approving suspicious transactions, and she placed beside them genuine originals of his signature that she had collected, signatures on unrelated documents, verified by time and source. She invited the court to look at them, and she pointed out, one detail at a time, the subtle differences the naked eye might miss, but once made clear could not be denied. The slant of a stroke, the way one letter joined the next, the pressure of the pen in places where the habit of a real hand left traces that a false hand could never fully copy. Ruiz continued after her, submitting to the court the examination results from independent experts he had brought in, handwriting analysts certified in different places, so no one could claim the findings had been staged, and all of them reached the same conclusion, that the signatures on the incriminating documents had not been written by Marsh, but were the work of another hand, a hand that had practiced for a long time to imitate his writing. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. Whispers rose from the public benches, reporters bent low over their notes, and at the prosecution's table, the confidence from earlier began to crack, as the prosecutor realized the foundation of his case was being shaken from the very place he had believed was strongest. But Delaney did not stop there. She turned to the next part of the file, and she placed before the court a simple yet sharp question. If Marsh had not signed these documents, then who had enough access, enough authority, and enough time to create them? She traced the shell companies the prosecution had used to prove the flow of illegal money, and instead of letting them lead back to Marsh as the prepared script had intended, she showed that each company, when followed to its source, had been created and operated by the same person, the person whose name appeared on the earliest records before every trace was deliberately blurred. She read that name aloud before the court, and that name was Wesley Payne. The entire courtroom seemed to stop for a beat, and hundreds of eyes turned at once toward the man sitting in the prosecution's witness row. Payne still managed to keep his calm appearance, but the hand resting on his knee had tightened, and when the confused prosecutor looked toward him, as though searching for an explanation. Payne only gave a small shake of his head, offered a faint smile, and said this was a desperate attempt to shift blame onto someone else, that anyone could manufacture papers to frame another person. But this time, his usually smooth voice carried a slight ripple, a tiny haste that everyone paying attention could feel, and Delaney seized that exact moment. She told the court that she understood why the words of an unknown woman, holding a few papers, might be doubted, that she did not expect the court to believe her simply because she said so, and that she had also anticipated that a man who had hidden everything so subtly would deny it to the end. That was why, she said, she had not come here only with signatures on paper. She lifted her eyes and looked straight at Payne across the space of the courtroom, her gaze calm and unwavering, and she said there was one more thing she wanted to submit to the court, something no forged stroke of a pen could deny, something paid for with the very life of an honest man. Then she reached into the file, and the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for what this woman was about to bring into the light. Delaney placed a small recording device on the table and asked the court's permission to play a recording she said had been captured inside the organization's own office area. And although the prosecution objected again, the judge motioned for her to continue, because by then the entire room had been drawn into something larger than procedure. She pressed the button, and in the absolute silence of the courtroom, a voice rose from the device, a voice everyone in the room had been hearing all morning. The smooth and composed voice of Wesley Payne. But this time that voice was not playing the role of an honest subordinate. It was speaking to someone over the phone while he believed no one else remained in the building, and every word that came from the machine cut through the mask he had worn for so many years like a blade. That voice recounted, with the cold calm of a man boasting about his own victory, how patiently he had created the shell companies, how meticulously he had learned to imitate his boss's signature, how he had arranged for every stream of money to point back toward Marsh in the end, and how he had waited for years until the exact right moment to pull the trap down. And then that voice mentioned something that made Delaney's hand clench, a name from the past, when Payne, in his arrogance, spoke about a woman years earlier who had almost ruined everything for him when she discovered the improper numbers, and about how neatly he had handled her before she could speak. The whole courtroom went dead silent, and every eye turned toward the man in the witness seat, the man who for 20 years had never revealed even the faintest trace of emotion beyond his carefully practiced composure. This time, that shell shattered. Payne sprang up from his chair before his lawyer could stop him, his once calm face now white and twisted with real panic, and he shouted that the recording was fake, fabricated, staged, his voice cracking, stripped of the softness that had once made so many people trust him, exposing the thing that had been underneath it all along. But that very loss of control accused him more clearly than any evidence could have, because an innocent man facing a false recording would be confused, while only a man hearing his own voice betray him would panic like that. Delaney stood still in the middle of the chaos, saying nothing more, simply letting the voice from the device continue to speak and do its work. And in that moment she thought of the man who had traded his life to capture these words, the man who had placed them in her hands with trembling fingers, and she told him silently that his sacrifice had not been meaningless, that the very voice he had risked everything to record was now rising in a courtroom to speak the truth so many people had tried to bury. In the courtroom, the judge struck her gavel again and again to restore order as the reporters stirred and the murmurs rose like waves, while the prosecutor stood frozen beside his table, looking down at the stack of documents he had believed only hours earlier to be a certain conviction, now turned into a meaningless pile of paper. At the defendant's table, Marsh sat motionless, and he did not look at Payne, did not look at the reporters, but looked toward the woman standing in the middle of the courtroom, the woman who had stepped into his life on a rainy night and was now standing there, removing from him the judgment the whole city had believed impossible to overturn. In his eyes there was something far beyond relief or gratitude, a belated understanding that the only person who had fought for him when all those he had once favored turned their backs was the very woman who had never taken a single dollar from him and had never once been afraid of him. Court officers moved toward Payne as he continued stammering hopeless denials, and the truth The thing he had kept imprisoned in darkness for so many years finally stepped into the light in the very voice of the man who had tried to bury it. As order gradually returned and the court officers had forced Payne back into his seat while he was still stammering denials, Delaney asked the judge for permission to say one final thing, and her voice now was entirely different from the sharpness she had used. When presenting evidence, lower, more private, as though the words she was about to speak were not meant for the whole courtroom but for one person who was no longer alive, she said that the name of the woman Payne had just mentioned in the recording, the woman who had discovered the improper numbers years ago and had paid with her life before she could speak, was not a stranger's name to her. She said that woman's name was Eleanor Rourke, and that she was her mother. The entire courtroom fell still, and Delaney stood straight inside that silence, not crying, not letting her voice break, because she had already given too many nights to this grief, and now what she needed was not tears but for the truth to finally be spoken in full. She briefly told them that she had grown up with an incomplete story about her mother's death, that for all these years she had thought it was something no one could ever change, until piece after piece of the truth slowly opened and led her to the very man sitting over there. She said she had not walked into this courtroom only to save a man who had been falsely accused, but also to reclaim justice for a woman who had been robbed of both her life and her truth, and that it was strange how fate had arranged for those two things to turn out to be one and the same, for the man who had harmed her mother years ago, and then had trapped out her benefactor today to be the same person. She turned to look at Payne, and she said that for all these years he had believed he could bury everything. That time would erase the trail, and the people who knew the truth would fall silent one by one. But he had forgotten one thing, that the truth never truly dies. It only waits for someone patient enough and brave enough to bring it back. At the defendant's table, Marsh sat silently, and on his face there slowly appeared a belated understanding, as each piece fell into its proper place. He understood that the woman who had stitched his wound on a rainy night, the woman who had pushed his money back and demanded the truth, the woman who had stayed beside him when everyone else turned away, had not stepped into his life by accident. He understood that behind the gratitude she had always refused to turn into obedience, behind her strange, unshakable firmness, there was a private pain she had carried in silence, and that when she fought to clear his name, she had also been fighting for the mother whose face she had never had the chance to remember. He looked at her with an expression he had never given anyone before, a reverence mixed with sorrow, and he realized that all this time he had thought he was the one who owed her, when in truth both of them had been paying the same debt life had laid down many years before they ever met. After allowing Delaney's words to settle, the judge declared that in light of such weighty new evidence, the trial could not continue in the direction it had been going, and she ordered a new investigation into Wesley Payne, while suspending all charges against Marsh until the truth could be fully brought to light. When the court officers led Payne down the aisle between the rows of benches, he passed the place where Delaney stood, and for one brief instant their eyes met. The eyes of the man who had caused the loss and the woman who had spent all her patience bringing him into the light. But Delaney said nothing, because nothing more needed to be said. Everything that had to be spoken had already been spoken in this room. She only stood there, straight-backed and calm, and when Payne had been led out of sight behind the door, she lifted her eyes toward the high ceiling of the courtroom, breathed out a long breath she had been holding for all these years, and in her heart she spoke to the mother she had never had the chance to call by name, telling her that at last, after all this time, she could rest, because her truth had finally come home, in the months after the trial, as the charges against Marsh were removed one by one, and the investigation into Payne gradually sealed the fate of the man who had hidden his crimes for so many years. The man who had once ruled the harbor through fear began a task more difficult than anything he had ever done, rebuilding everything in a completely different way. He did not try to restore the old empire, did not summon back those who had turned their backs on him, but slowly turned what remained into something that could stand under daylight without needing to hide. He changed the transport routes that had once been used to conceal questionable money, flows into lawful contracts, turned shell companies into real businesses that created jobs for people who had no idea the places where they worked had once been part of the darkness. The work was slow, full of obstacles, and more than once he had to sit in meetings where people dared to oppose him, argue with him, tell him he was wrong, something no one in the old world had ever dared to do. He learned how to listen to those difficult words instead of silencing them, and though the process was hard and sometimes irritated him, he gradually realized that an organization built on respect demanded far more effort than one built on fear, but it was also sturdier in a way he had never known before. One evening, while sitting alone in the office that was now lit again and filled once more with the sound of people passing in and out, Marsh realized that for the first time in many years, he had slept through the night, not the shallow sleep of a man always keeping watch, but the peaceful sleep of someone who no longer had anything to hide. As for Delaney, she did not accept any position in his new organization, and when Marsh offered, she refused with the same honesty he had come to know. "This is your work," she told him, "not mine. I'll help you rebuild the foundation, but I'm not the person meant to stand guard over it." What she accepted was something else, a medical care fund for poor people who could not afford treatment, created from the very money that had now been made transparent. And she firmly insisted that the fund must not bear the Marsh name, must not be tied to any name that might make people hesitate. "People should believe in the work the fund does," she said when someone asked why, "not in the name that paid for it." The fund quietly paid hospital bills for patients who had no one to stand up for them, kept programs like the pediatric ward, where she still worked every morning, alive, and helped people standing on the edge the way she herself had once stood, without display, without asking for gratitude, simply present when people needed it. And Cora, the child who had crossed the fragile border of life and returned, was now healthy again, her cheeks full, her eyes bright with the complete joy of childhood. One morning when Delaney stepped into the pediatric ward as usual, Cora ran to greet her, both hands hiding a secret behind her back, and when the girl held it out, in her small palm lay a paper crane folded far more carefully than those clumsy first cranes from long ago, its wings even and its neck raised proudly. "I can fold one all by myself now," the girl announced, her eyes shining with pride, "and I folded this one for you, so it can stay with you forever." Delaney accepted the crane with both hands, and in that moment she felt her chest tighten with an emotion she could not put into words, because the child standing before her, healthy and radiant, was the living proof that everything she and the good people around her had endured had not been meaningless. She crouched down to the girl's height, placed the paper crane in her breast pocket, exactly where an old man had once kept the first crane, and she told Cora she would keep it very carefully, that it would fly with her a long, long way. Cora laughed, then pulled her hand toward the window, where the morning sunlight was pouring in, and the two of them stood there together, looking out at a new day opening before them. A peaceful day, like any other peaceful day that now, after everything, finally belonged to them. 7 years had passed since the rainy night at the back door of St. Meridian Hospital, and the city of Chicago still changed its coat with every season as it always had, the winters still cold, and the rains still coming. But some things had changed in ways only those who had lived through them could truly understand. On a late autumn evening, when the last leaves were leaving the branches and the air was beginning to turn sharp, a man and a woman returned to stand beside the brick wall near the hospital's back door, exactly where, many years earlier, a nurse had crouched beside a bleeding stranger and refused to take his money, demanding the truth instead. They did not say much, because after all those years they had learned that some moments did not need words. Marsh set a still warm box of food beside the wall. Like the box of food Delaney had once brought him in that empty room on the loneliest night of his life, and this had become a small ritual the two of them kept whenever the cold season returned, a quiet way of remembering the place where everything had begun. He was no longer the man whose name made the whole city lower its voice, but the man behind a transparent network of businesses that provided work for hundreds of people, and at night he slept peacefully, in a way the man he had been 7 years earlier could never have imagined. Delaney was still a nurse, still went to the pediatric ward every morning, and the fund she had created still quietly paid hospital bills for those who had no one to stand up for them, bearing no name other than the work it did. "You once asked me why I wasn't afraid of you," Delaney said softly, looking down at the food between them. I think now you understand. Marsh nodded, and he said it had taken him years to understand what she had taught him in a single night. That real strength was not making other people fear you, but daring to let another person see who you truly were without hiding. They stood there for a while in silence, and in both their hearts rose the image of an old man who had given up everything for the truth. The man because of whom a child had lived, an innocent man had been cleared, and a dead mother had finally found justice. Cora was now a healthy young woman, bright, studious, and full of dreams, and on her desk there was always a paper crane, though she had never known the whole story behind the adults who had quietly kept her childhood safe from every shadow. Before leaving, Delaney looked toward the hospital door, where the light still spilled out the way it had that night, and she thought that somewhere in this wide city, right at this very moment, there might be another person standing at the edge, cold and alone, waiting for someone to reach out a hand, not with money, but with sincere kindness. And if their story leaves anything behind, it is the reminder that a person's dignity can never be bought with money, that the kindness we plant today, no matter how small, is the most enduring investment a human life can ever make, because one day it may return to save us or someone we love at the exact moment we need it most, and that no matter how long darkness tries to hide the truth, truth is the only thing that remains in the end, so long as there is one person brave enough to bring it into the light. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so you won't miss the meaningful stories we send to you every day. How do you feel about Delaney's journey and the people in this story? Please leave a comment and tell us what remains in your heart, because we always hope to hear your most honest feelings. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, peaceful lives, and joy in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.